Well, good afternoon and welcome. This is the last day of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. We're getting toward the end, but we have saved the best for last. This is a topic that I think some of you might have been talking about this week, trade. And in fact, this session ends precisely as President Donald Trump begins to start speaking here in the annual meeting. And so we will see whether our esteemed panelists and our conversation connects at all with what we're going to hear coming out of Washington, D.C. But trade is, of course, a hot topic, and the title of the session, The Changing Nature of Trade, is perhaps an understatement, given how much, as you will hear, it is changing. Let me just say, I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevX. We are a media partner of the forum. We're delighted to be helping to bring this event to the forum stage today, and I'm joined by an esteemed group of panelists. Before I mention who they are, I'll just say that although when you think of trade today, and probably even more after the president's speech, you may immediately think of tariffs. That's not the only context. And what we want to bring to you is a sense of the much greater set of variables that are affecting a more complicated, nuanced picture of trade today. Of course, COVID really changed the nature of trade. Climate is changing it as companies react and countries react. Geopolitics is playing a huge role, and you might think the U.S. China competition, of course, that's important, the West and China, but of course there's sanctions on Russia, but also on other countries, growing use of sanctions. There's many more geopolitical fractures around the world that are affecting trade too. And then there's technology, the rapid advances in technology that are playing a big role in this space. So, I think you're going to get a chance to learn from some of the experts on exactly where trade is going and what are some of these factors as we consider how tariffs might impact this space. So let me mention this esteemed group I've got with me. Henadi Al-Saleh is at the end of our panel. She's the chair of the board of directors of Agility. We'll hear a little bit more about Agility in a moment, but it is one of the world's largest logistics firms, and they're very active around the world, and especially in the GCC where you're based. We have next to her Minister Alberto Van Claveren, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chile. Thank you, sir, for being here. And then next to me is Gan Kim Yong, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us. So I just want to start, maybe if I could, with you, Deputy Prime Minister. Coming from a global development perspective, we have long thought of trade as an answer to some of the problems in the world, right? That you have countries that are much lower income, that they're trying to rise up on the income scale, and they look to trade as an opportunity. That is not the narrative today. Mm-hmm. Today, trade in many parts of the world has become kind of a dirty word. How do you see it? Given Singapore's history, you are a trading hub in the world. How do you see it, and what do you think is the future for trade from here?
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I think it's a very important topic to talk about trade and how trade impacts the world. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, trade has been a very important part of Singapore's economy. In fact, global trade for Singapore constitutes 3 times of our GDP. So it's a very important part of our economy. And as you said, trade is an important solution to economic development and growth. It drives global economy to grow over the last 30 years and has lifted many of the poverty for many countries. But we must also be quite clear that trade is not the only element that solves the problem. It's not the only solution. Trade is part of the solution. Mm-hmm. At the same time, together with trade, we need to look at how investment can dovetail with the trading pattern, how investment will also uplift the economy of the developing countries and to lift up the quality of lives of their people. So I think it will also include investment in capability development to ensure that the population, the workers, are upskilled so that they are able to take advantage of the trading activities that's going on and the new investments that come into the country. How can you prepare your workers to be able to embrace the new jobs with the new skills that will be needed going forward? So I think the phases of trade is changing all the time, evolving all the time, and it doesn't just happen over the last 10 years, but of course I think it's accelerated over the last few years. But I think we need to be quite clear that in addition to trade, we need to also focus on a whole plethora of measures that we need to put in place in order to continue to drive economic growth and development for countries around the world, particularly the developing countries. But I would say that trade will continue to play an important part, but it's not the only part that we should focus on. We need to look at a plethora of other measures as well.
Yeah, it's one piece of a bigger puzzle when you're thinking about economic development. And I guess in richer countries today, here in Europe, in the US, if there's a complaint about trade, it's that it's exported jobs and that you've lost manufacturing jobs and it's hollowed out some communities and cities. And I guess if there's a complaint in some of the poorest countries is that it's exporting raw materials but not value-added products. And then, of course, you layer on top of that the risks of supply chain resilience and national security. I wonder, Minister, if I can bring you in the discussion, because so much of the trade that has grown, trade's grown a lot in the last couple of decades, so much of that is emerging markets. And you've been a big part of that, and your country has. How do you see the emerging market component, which is now still growing, but maybe not as fast as it was before?
Oh, yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Richard, really, and I'm very pleased to share this panel with these very distinguished panelists. Really, in the case of Chile, we are a medium-sized country in Latin America, and we have developed a very active trade policy since the 90s. Really, we developed that policy, obviously, in a very favorable context. There was a lot of optimism about the possibilities of trade, and we negotiated many trade agreements with almost all our important partners in the world, be it the United States, European Union, China, Japan, Singapore, other ASEAN countries, Latin American countries, etc. So I think probably more than 95% of our foreign trade is covered by agreements. But right now we are facing a completely different scenario, a scenario with major trade disruptions, as we know. Up to now, we have not been affected directly by those disruptions, but obviously, indirectly, we can be affected, especially if there is a major trade war. I mean, there is already a trade war between the United States and China, but obviously that war can be aggravated in the coming.
And both are major trading partners for you.
Right, exactly. Yes, we have a special situation because in trade terms, we are very dependent on China, on the Chinese market. Almost 40% of our foreign trade goes to one market, which is China. And that has to do with our exports, especially critical minerals, copper, lithium, and also agricultural products, which tend to be also very sensitive. So really, we ask ourselves, what's going to happen right now? You know, especially in the context of major disruptions, of threats of raising tariffs, we ask ourselves, will our trade agreements protect us or not? So we know we have to be flexible. Up to now, we have done very well. We crossed the barrier of the $100 billion in our exports, which is not bad for an economy as ours. But the context is changing, and we have to adapt to that changing context.
Well, I think Hennady is going to tell us what's going to change. Tell us first a little bit about agility so people understand the perspective you're bringing to this issue. And then try to answer this question, where do you see trade changing this year? I know the prediction is 3% increase, which would be a very low increase in global trade in 2025. But paint a little more of a nuanced picture. What does that actually mean for countries like Chile?
Yeah, so that's true. So a little bit about agility. So we are a global supply chain services company, and we invest in infrastructure, and we have various investments. We're the largest investor in DSV, the third largest freight forwarder around the world, and we operate all around the world. You know, so trade and logistics is part of our DNA since 1997. And you're right, you know, trade in merchandise is slowing. You know, last year it grew around 2.7%. This year it's targeted to grow around 3%. In reality, even though it's growing, it's only around 3/4 of the average since 1995. There are winners and there are losers, and there are, what you see is imbalance. For example, there are certain regions like Europe and the developing countries which are paying a price, and other countries are still growing. And I think you bring up a really important point. What do we need to do to hedge that? And how do we operate in order to protect our customers? And there are two important points. We think about diversification and investing in technology. So if you think about the past few years, actually mainly the 2 years, around 70% of the companies have shifted their supply chain, but that's still not enough. And they're doing it at a cost. A lot of the supply chains are moving to countries in more complex jurisdictions, so it takes more time and it costs more. So the nature of trade is changing.
And they're doing this to get closer to their own markets. So they're going to third countries they have more faith and trust in, nearshoring, friendshoring, that kind of thing?
That's exactly it. That's exactly what they're doing. But what they're also doing is they're investing in technology. However, they're not investing enough. And let me give you two examples in which, what we've been doing and what we believe companies and countries should be doing. When we talk about investing in technology, we're talking about two areas: actual technology, visibility. Today, if you ask any company, only around 11% of the companies around the world have real-time visibility. The rest, close to 80%, only have visibility within 1 week, which is not good enough. The other part is if you ask any company, what about your people? Companies are not investing in the skill set required for digitization. There's a really interesting survey, if I'm not mistaken, from McKinsey that said 90% of the companies that were surveyed, if they were asked about the digital skill sets of their employees, today they cannot help them accomplish their digital transformation strategy, which drives resilience and agility, which is needed in a time of extreme uncertainty.
Kim Yong, maybe you can describe a little bit, because you have a very modern approach to trade, to digitization, et cetera. How does technology fit into your conception of where trade goes and how you position Singapore as a major hub?
I agree fully that I think technology plays a very important part in supporting trade. Even the volume comes down or slows down to 3%, but there's a lot that we can do to facilitate trade so that we reduce the cost of trading. And technology is one part of it. Digitalization is very important. And in Singapore, we have embarked on the digitalization of our trade system. We are encouraging companies to go on the e-bill of lading, for example. We embark on the digital payment. We embark on digital customs clearance systems. And we are also embarking on the ASEAN-wide digitalization strategy. We are in the process of negotiating a digital economy framework agreement among ASEAN. So this will provide interoperability of systems. This will also touch on a unique digital identification. So when you trade with one another, you know exactly who you are trading with, because it's a unique digital identity. And we're also looking at how we can facilitate digital payment so that it's seamless and lower costs. Remove the margins that the middlemen will have to charge, and that will facilitate trade, even though the volume may grow slower. But I think there's a lot more we can do to facilitate and to reduce the cost of trading. So I think this is one area that Singapore is embarking on. But of course, I totally agree that real-time visibility is very important. In fact, we have we have launched what we call TradeX, SG TradeX. This is an end-to-end digital monitoring of the entire supply chain. So this will help companies to understand at any point in time where their cargoes are, and on what shipment, what's the status of the shipment. And not only the customer has visibility, the financiers, the bankers also know where your cargoes are and what's the status of your shipment. And that way you actually reduce the cost of monitoring, the cost of financing. So there are many things we can do through technology to continue to support and encourage trading among nations.
Just quickly, I'm curious, do you think this is a comparative advantage? In other words, and maybe Hanadi, you want to answer this, do companies, when they're assessing where are we going to have our supply come from, do they look at whether a country has a very strong digitized trading platform that maybe lets them lower costs? Is it a real comparative advantage that countries can compete on?
So absolutely. And I think, so historically, if you think about sort of Maslow's triangle of self-actualization and you apply it to logistics, the base of it historically was pricing competitiveness and efficient labor in order to self-actualize in trade and be efficient and grow and all that stuff. Today, that's slightly changed. On the base, you have security, you've got friendshoring, which becomes quite expensive and becomes very difficult to compete. So making sure if you have a trading hub that is digitized and has especially around the customs side, the most complex side of trade is really the customs clearance aspect. Digitizing it, making it visible, ensuring that you can easily, clear goods within a specific time, I think is a very strong comparative advantage for a country.
Can I just add that I must do a bit of a sales pitch for Singapore? We are one of the key ingredients and components feature of a trading hub is the connectivity. Connectivity at different levels. First, connectivity at the shipping lines, at the air connectivity, that's quite obvious as physical connectivity. And Singapore being at the hub of Southeast Asia, I think the connectivity is a very strong selling point for us in trading. But at the same time, connectivity also relates to free trade agreements, the arrangements that we have with our neighbors, ASEAN, and with the rest of the world. Singapore has 27 free trade agreements with different parts of the world. We cover more than 90% of the world's GDP. So that is very important. But lastly, I think that we touched on just now, and that's digital connectivity. So in addition to physical connectivity and free trade agreements, we also need to be able to digitally connect up with our key trading partners. That is harder to do because it's both ends of the digital connectivity. Not just Singapore, but our destination, our intermediate points also have to be digitalized. So I think this is something that is a work in progress. We continue to work with our partners to develop and enhance their digital capability. And that's why we have the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement to help the whole of ASEAN level up the digital capability. But there's a new component that's coming into the fore, and that is sustainability. Because many of these connections will be carbon heavy. And we have to look at how can we ensure that in time to come, your maritime shipping is sustainable. We're also looking at the green shipping lanes, for example, linking up key ports in the world to enable them to be green fuel, sustainable fuel ready. Because there are many options of different types of sustainable fuel, and we have to ensure that all these ports are equipped with capability to refuel the ships so that they can return. Otherwise, you can deliver to the port with your sustainable fuel, hydrogen or ammonia, but if you cannot refuel, you won't be able to return. Yeah. So you need to have these green shipping lanes lined up, and this is something that we are working on. All this is about connectivity at different levels.
It's very interesting for Chile, which is going to be one of the world's biggest hubs of green hydrogen. But maybe we can take a slightly Latin American perspective, Minister. Give us a sense, because within Latin America, intra-regional trade is actually a lot lower.
Right.
What is the historical reason for that? And is that an opportunity now, for countries like yours that are so focused on trade and you're aggressively trading with many places in the world, but much less within with your neighbors? Well,
that's true. Well, it has to do with our history, and it has also to do with the products we export. We have a sort of hubs and spokes system, in a sense that many Latin American countries export the same things to the same partners in the world. Yeah. For instance, if you take into account copper, well, it's very clearly Chile, Peru are copper producers, exporters, but obviously, we are not interested in buying Peruvian copper. We have some similarities between countries. But on the other hand, what's also true is that we have a very low integration between our countries. There is, if you go to Latin America, there's always a rhetoric in favor of integration. We started integration, even historically speaking, before the European Union, but still we are under 20%. And there is very low interdependence, and that means also very few incentives to build up more integration, like ASEAN countries, for instance, have done. So that's really a missing point in our case. Right now, we are attempting to develop value chains, in Latin America. If you look at, for instance, Brazil and Argentina, in Mercosur, the automotive industry is to a certain extent integrated, but it's a very exceptional case. Yeah. For instance, we are part of the Pacific Alliance, which has a lot of promise. Four countries participate. It's Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. But Mexico is very much oriented towards the US market. Colombia has a different structure. And Peru and Chile, we export similar products to the rest of the world. So there are not many incentives to integrate more in terms of trade.
Just as a little anecdote, not long ago, I was in Medellin, Colombia,
Yes.
Which is a city with a lot of air pollution because it's surrounded by mountains and it's in a valley. And I met a social entrepreneur there who was converting gas cars to electric. And he said, I have a lot of problems in my business, but one is the copper and lithium needed for electrification. It comes from my neighbor in Chile, but it's sent to China. And I have to buy my motors and my batteries from China. They have to come here. So it raises the costs. And it's part of why it's a hard business to really scale up. And you can imagine, especially with electrification, a big opportunity for regional integration.
But in the case of lithium, it's really very striking because lithium is exported to China, even by American company. I mean, one of the biggest operators in the lithium industry in Chile is an American company, but they export to China, not to the United States. And it's elaborated in China, and from there it comes to...
But some of this might change, and you mentioned Mexico and its orientation to the US. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about countries like Mexico. There may be new hubs that come up because of their proximity, just given geopolitics.
So, listen, we at Agility, we've invested in infrastructure that's linked to supply chains all around the world. We have an aviation company which manages airports all around the world. And in the past few years, we managed 6 airports in Mexico. The level of activity, especially around cargo, has increased several fold. If I look in the GCC, where we have invested in warehouses in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, one of our key platforms, where Saudi Arabia is set to become a superconnector hub. What you have over there is these countries that are investing in infrastructure, doubling down, and the level of activity is increasing. And I just want to come back to your point also. When you talk about digitization, the value of digitization for all private sector and everyone around the world is really clarity. In a time with so much uncertainty, having that clarity and understanding, even when changes take place, at least it's digitized, it gives me visibility, I know what the rules I need to adjust toward, is quite critical. And that's where the super hubs and the investments in countries like Mexico or in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, this is a critical aspect which leads to survival. When I say survival, not just surviving, but actually thriving. And that's one critical aspect in which you see these super hubs benefiting and are set to win part of the disruption going forward.
I want to come to our audience in a moment for questions. So I'm just giving you the warning to think up your questions. I'll come to you in just a moment. But just to follow on this idea, you talked about Albemarle, I think, is the big American lithium company.
Exactly.
They're taking lithium from Chile to China. What might shift is maybe they'll take it to Mexico. A lot of production might end up in countries like Vietnam, places where the world can sort of agree, and yet it's not China or the US or some of the geopolitical tension countries that will cause bigger issues. How do you see, given that's a pretty big dynamic, several-fold increase in cargo, how do you think that affects your approach to trade in Chile?
Well, I think it's a very important issue. On the one hand, we also want to add value to our exports, and that's especially true in the case of lithium. To a certain extent, we don't want to produce batteries, but to go up in the scale of production. But on the other hand, we are also still aiming at diversification. For us, that's absolutely essential, and that means diversifying. Even within Latin America, there are possibilities. Some economies are opening up. On the other hand, the Emirates, we signed a CEPA agreement with the Emirates. We are interested in Saudi Arabia. So ASEAN is also a priority for us. Very important markets, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. So there are possibilities, and we are continuing on that road. On the other hand, diversification also means different exports, and not only goods, also services. And services is also a sector which is starting to develop in our country, you know. Although we are far away from the main economies, we have some advantages to provide services within Latin America. Latin America is a very important market for us in terms of offering services. So there is future, I think, in that area. And what our data also prove, you know, that there is an important increase in terms of our services exports.
That's interesting, although I think services might be an area that gets very disrupted by AI as well.
Right.
We had to mention AI at least once in this panel. and I think it's true that some of these services, whether it's accounting services or legal or back office, many of those may get quite disrupted by artificial intelligence. I'm just looking to see if we have questions, but I'm going to ask our Deputy Prime Minister for one last question as you think them up. Singapore is kind of in a unique case. We talked about super connector hubs. They tend to be, it sounds like, in the case of Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Vietnam, bigger countries with natural resources, with more of a labor force. You're a much smaller country, right, without those natural resources. How do you think of your strategy in that picture? Is it aligning yourself with other countries in the region? Or how do you remain such a relevant hub in this new era of trade?
Well, you're right that Singapore is a very small country. But we don't look at ourselves as Singapore. We look at Singapore as part of the larger Asia, and particularly ASEAN. So many countries are interested in ASEAN. So Singapore's role really is to find ways to add value to ASEAN as a hub. So it is much easier for a lot of these companies to operate in Singapore, but serve the region. So I think we look at the integration within ASEAN as a plus, not as a competitive issue. So within ASEAN, many countries, Singapore and versus many other countries, are complementary in nature. So I think taking the minister's point, I think for economies that are competitive with one another, competing with one another, it's harder for them to have integration and collaboration because they're doing the same things, selling to the same market, the same customer, tapping on the same resources. But in ASEAN, there's a lot of complementarity. We are specialized in different areas and doing well in specific areas, and we add value to the overall ASEAN. So I think I always remind our people that Singapore will do well when our region does well. And the region will do well when the whole world is doing well. So I think we want to find a way to continue to ride on the global economy and play a part in the logistics, in the supply chain, so that we are a keynote of the economic growth and development.
I look to our audience to see if anyone has a question or a comment, something they'd like to add to the discussion. And if not, we have one here. Okay, we can bring a microphone. Just wait until the mic comes to you. And just do us the favor of telling us your name and organization, if you would, as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Malebo Mabichi Thompson. I'm from South Africa, from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Just a question on the new clean products that the world needs to resolve the climate change issues. What your views are on the rules that are essentially closing market and in a way suppressing innovation, and what can be done to have rules that allows innovation to thrive so that we can actually have these products that are going to help the world for real to deal with climate change. Thanks.
And I think maybe part of what we're hearing is the tariffs on solar panels, on batteries, that there is, especially with China's huge role in production there. It's an excellent question. How do you see it? Hanadi, do you have a thought about this issue where the whole world, especially Europe, wants to build an industry, they want to electrify, but maybe they don't want to take the dependence they had on Russian gas and move it to a dependence on Chinese solar. How does this develop?
So I think it's quite clear, and I agree with you. You know, there are certain, segments of people, businesses, and technologies that are paying a price. You think about, when it comes to tariffs, I think, you have small to medium-sized enterprises paying a price. You have consumers paying a price. I mean, with the tariffs, the U.S. households can pay up to anywhere between $2,600 to $3,500 a year if tariffs were to be implemented. And especially when it comes to EV, you're right. It is paying a price at a time when you need adoption. There are all these challenges in order, to ensure there's adoption and the free flow of EVs. But this is where I think from the private sector, it's incumbent upon them to continue. So we as Agility for a long time, because of the CO2 emissions coming out of the logistics sector, we've tried to hedge that bet. We've invested in one of the largest EV charger stations around the world as a critical aspect from our investment arm. We've invested in a fuel agnostic generator as part of our sort of synergistic hedge, and sustainability arm, in order to make sure we're committed not simply to the business, but to the environment and people. And I think this is irrespective of what happens today in terms of tariffs, there is the long view, and we need to all manage towards that long view.
So let's just play out this scenario, unless either of you want to jump into this question here about Chinese. Yeah, please.
I'll just say that climate change is really an existential challenge, not just for any particular country. I think it's universal. And this global problem actually requires a global solution. So all the countries have to find a way to come together, work together, so that we're able to address this global problem in a collective way. So I think sharing and working partnership is very critical. I'll just give you one example. Within ASEAN, we are looking at how we can share energy, green energy. Because there are pockets in ASEAN that they have a shortage of green energy, and there are certain parts of ASEAN that have excess green energy. They want to sell their green energy. So what is required is to have interconnectivity of electrons among the ASEAN countries. Therefore, we are embarking on this idea of ASEAN integrated power grid, so that we connect up all the ASEAN countries. Areas where you have access, you can sell it to another country. Areas where countries that are short of energy can purchase the green energy. And sometimes within the same country, there may be seasons that your green energy is not producing enough, and therefore you need to import from other countries. So I think this ASEAN integrated power grid will be the next innovation that will help us address the energy issue within ASEAN. That's just one example.
Does that require land borders?
That's right. And because this is an integrated power grid, the challenge, of course, is cross-border. And therefore, the countries are working together to see how we need to amend our legislation to allow cross-border trading of electrons. I think cross-border trading of goods is something that we have been doing all these years. Yeah. But to trade electrons is something that's a new concept. How do we deal with it, and who is accountable for the greenness of the electrons is something that we will need to work out. So I think it is something that is important for us, and we have started the journey. It will take some time for us to realize the idea, but I think you get the sense that that's the direction we should be going. And another example, which is also very critical, is carbon credits. And Singapore is very keen to invest in carbon projects, and we have been to Latin America, Chile, and other countries to see whether there were potential for us to invest in carbon projects so that you create carbon credits, and the carbon credits will then be used for Singapore to offset some of our carbon emission. This way, actually, the capital will then flow into the countries where you invest in carbon solutions, and that creates jobs, creates investment, creates industries. At the same time, you address the green issue. And therefore, it's a win-win proposition. So I think at the end of the day, the main message really is that to address this climate change challenge requires collective effort from everyone, every country in the world. So I think this is something that's very difficult to do, but it is necessary.
Maybe Minister van Cleveren, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Right. Well, yes, climate change also presents obviously a challenge for all of us, and Chile is affected by climate change, but on the other hand, climate change offers opportunities in our specific case, precisely because, we are developing green hydrogen, and really it's a very ambitious program. On the other hand, we are also exporting lithium, and we're trying to change the technology of extraction of lithium, and we are also trying to preserve at least 1/3 of the salt flats of lithium, because of their value for biodiversity. And that on the one hand. On the other side, we are also developing instruments, especially for the private sector, which are called clean production agreements. They are voluntary. you know, but if a company which produces certain products forms part of one of those agreements, they propose that to the state, it's approved, and they have incentives, you know, and they can also get special credit lines which are necessary to continue to develop that product.
So maybe we can just play out the scenario of what's likely to happen. President Trump is going to speak in 10 minutes. Let's say he doesn't reverse course, and we are facing significant tariffs. They're not just threats. Let's say they're actually imposed significant tariffs on China, maybe even on Mexico and Canada. How does this affect global trade? Kind of play it out for us, if you could. Maybe we can start with you, Hannadi.
I mean, the World Bank just a few days ago came out with a statistic that said if the U.S. imposes Trumps and there are retaliatory, impact, the world will pay close to 0.3% on global GDP. And that is a lot. That's trillions of dollars. So that's, tangible impact. And then you have all that level of uncertainty that everyone has to live with. And if you haven't invested in technology and you haven't invested in digitizing your supply chain, you have not diversified and you haven't thought about your skill set, in order to catch up and ramp up, it's going to take time. So I think the impact is quite tangible.
And isn't it all inflationary too? In other words, the tariffs are kind of like a tax, and so they add cost. But also all the other trends we talked about, trying to green the economy, that costs more. There's big investments. That's kind of inflationary. Moving to these superconnector hubs is sort of inflationary because you have to invest in digital programs and changing your supply chain. Is there a chance the whole world has been suffering, Latin America a lot, from inflation, that this will be with us a lot longer as a result of this?
Well, that's a danger. And it's also inflation for the United States, especially.
Sure.
Yes, especially if you get higher tariffs. Usually, the consumers are going to pay the cost of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let me share my views. I think my response is really we need to be prepared for the worst, but always hope for the best. And but to be prepared for the worst, you have to accept that there may be a new normal, a new balance that we need to strike, and there will be changes in the manufacturing production base, and there will be shifts in the supply chain reorganization of the supply chain. So I think there will be challenges, there will be crises, there will also be opportunities, and I think I always say that I'm confident that the private sector, the entrepreneurs, will find a way to adapt to this new balance or this new structure. But at the end of the day, as you pointed out, there will be additional costs. Whenever we try to go against the natural economic forces, you will result in a higher cost because there's more inefficiency when you try to go against the natural economic forces, drivers. But at the same time, the cost impact may not be even across the board. Some countries may benefit from it because you get more investment into your country, you get more trade going through your country. There may be countries that will suffer more because you bear the brunt of the impact of the cost. So I think it's yet to be seen how it will eventually play out. But at the end of the day, I think there will also be differences in the nature of the cost. Tariffs is one thing, but the investment, the cost of climate change is another because it's quite different. The investment in climate change, although it has an additional cost element, but this is to ensure that the world is sustainable.
Yeah.
And the business is sustainable. It is not just an inflationary in impact, but also to make sure that we have a better world in time to come. Investment in digitalization, although it's costly, the idea is that at the end of the day, you become more competitive, and in fact, it should help you save costs and increase your margin. And that, in the end, is investment. So you do expect returns on the investment that you make in digitalization and skills upgrading and technology. I think there are different cost elements, so it's important not to mix them all up.
Yeah, I agree. And fundamentally, trade is not going anywhere. Every region relies on trade, especially for one important aspect of their supply chain. They're dependent in terms of importing or exporting it, at least 25% of that good. So it's not going anywhere, and that's why, and in order to solve or manage disruption, you cannot do it alone, and that's why from our perspective, it's really critical that public-private dialogue and partnerships take place, especially during times of uncertainty. So today, disruptions take place every 3.5 years. And for a company over a span of 10 years, they can lose up to 45% of their net profit given this disruption. So public-private partnerships, where Agility is quite focused on, is really important. Having that dialogue, focusing on digitization and integration smooths things out. It doesn't solve it, but it facilitates it.
Yeah, these are long-term investments that may pay off over a long time horizon. But you did say earlier, Hennady, that there will be winners and losers. And I wonder, when you think about low-income countries, we don't have any represented on the stage. We haven't really heard much about them because when you think of the superconnector hubs, they tend to be middle income. So what happens to the lowest income countries that are trying to get on the ladder of development through trade and now find themselves waking up to trade wars, to higher costs? What do they do? How do you understand the picture from their perspective? Any of you?
Well, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, my sense is that this is a global issue, and trade in the past has been always been a win-win for many decades because we're starting from a relatively low base, and every country benefits from trade. And whether you're high income, low income, everybody benefits from trade, and we are able to uplift the people's quality of life, standard of living, and eliminate significantly the poverty issue. But increasingly, as we make progress, you find that the divergence become more significant. So some win more and some win less. And beyond a certain point, you find that some are winning, some are losing. So I think this is a time when we have to relook at how we organize our trade to make sure that the trade that we moving forward trade is inclusive. Inclusive in the sense that everyone that trades must be able to benefit from it. Yeah. And this way you demonstrate the value of trade. At the same time, you also want to make sure that even within the same country, when you trade with other countries, some segments of your country may be benefiting more than others. Yeah. Some segments of the population may be benefiting from the trading activities, some may be losing. So how do you balance it to make sure that even within the same country, trade is inclusive, so everyone benefits from development and trading. So I think that's the key challenge facing all of us.
Had we balanced that more, we might have different politics in many countries in the world today, right?
That's right.
Minister, I look to you on this question because in your region there are many lower income countries, some are really struggling. How do you see their situation in a world where maybe we're looking at a global trade war?
Complicated, very complicated. I mean, to be quite frank,
yeah.
There are not many facilities for them. I mean, especially that has also to do with the facilities you can get from the WTO, but we all know that the WTO is also facing important problems. Tomorrow there's going to be a ministerial meeting, an informal ministerial meeting, but really they have a problem, right?
Yeah, the WTO is, I guess, less relevant in a world of bilateral agreements and trade wars.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Well, just as we wrap up, maybe your thought on where do we go from here, Minister? Assuming this is the reality, how will countries react? I assume if tariffs are placed on them, they'll place tariffs as well. Is that the likely scenario?
Well, it depends on the country. It depends on the country. It depends on if you have a deficit or a superavit with the United States, which is very important for President Trump. Fortunately, we have a superavit, so we are not on the list. But anyway, up to now.
There's going to be a speech soon.
Right, exactly. So wait and see. But we have to adapt somehow. And yes, and countries have always been able to adapt themselves. So, right.
Hennady, I give you the last word. We are entering a period of great disruption, as has been clear. This is the space you live in and work in and look at so closely. Any guiding thoughts for people? How do you navigate a period like this in trade disruption?
I wish I could say it's quite simple, but it's not. But I think you need to focus on being agile and resilient. I mean, those are critical elements. And the way to become agile and resilient is really to diversify and invest in technology. It's easy to say. It can be easy to execute if you're focused on it. Diversify, hedge your bets. Think about your supply chain. That's one aspect. And then the technology aspect, it's basics, things as basic as visibility and as I don't want to say as complicated, but as evolved as AI. And then think about your people, invest in your people. I think those are critical aspects in which you need to think about going forward and to survive all these changes. They're going to, disruption is part of the game now. It's nothing new.
Yeah, this is the new normal.
Exactly.
Well, I thank all of you for joining us here, all of you who are joining this online. I thank this fantastic panel for helping to illuminate this very timely and important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.